All right, well, for those of you who are regular subscribers, I'm technically on hibernation status for the winter, at least until I get a few things in order. But since Wikipedia is blacking out its website today in protest against SOPA, I figure I'd make a few videos in solidarity with them. Yeah, definitely oppose SOPA. It's the whole premise of the whole idea of having the executive branch or the legislative branch being able to block out videos, to have some kind of a committee that decides that this website needs to be blocked, is very dangerous. It's a violation not only of the First Amendment, but of the common law principle of no prior restraint. It's a false issue. As it is, right now, a judge has the power to levy a fine against a website that's convicted of copyright violations. And if they're foreign websites, well, you go to their government and say, hey guys, we're not going to have preferential trade agreements with you unless you take care of this issue. Okay? In fact, I don't believe in all this global nonsense free trade anyway, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, definitely oppose SOPA, and definitely do not vote for anybody who voted for indefinite detention, the NDAA bill. I don't care what their stands are on other issues. I don't care how many reservations, quote unquote, that they have. Do not vote for such people at all, period. Do not vote for people who do not understand the difference between a constitutional republic and a dictatorship. I have my handy-dandy copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And there's something, I'm going to be discussing it in a minute, but there's something I know from American history, and that is there was a reason why the colonists eventually got on the side of independence. Now, I know that John Adams said that a third was in favor of independence, a third neutral, and a third Tory. But I've read revised figures stating that the number who favored independence initially was more like 2/5 to a half, and they were the most adamant. There were others who were neutral, and maybe a fifth or something like that Tory. That's what the figures seem to suggest. It's hard to say. There haven't been any real studies. I don't think they did polling in those days quite in the way that we would do them today. Okay, scientific polls, private, independent. Basically, you were whatever your neighbors were if you knew it was good for you. And the fact of the matter is that the independence position became the dominant hegemonic position, in a sense, if you want to call it that. The dominant position in the life of the colonists for a particular reason. And that had nothing to do with taxes on tea. Taxes on tea, that was not the real reason for independence. It had nothing to do even with the issue of representation, because most of the people were not represented. Now, the idea of Lockean philosophy, that had an appeal among the intellectuals, it had an appeal among people who were educated, and it probably had an appeal in urban centers like Boston or Philadelphia. But most people out in the countryside, they were too busy making a living to care about things like that. And they would not have been represented in Parliament anyway. What drove them to independence was the Redcoats occupying Boston. Or at least in that direction. Okay, over time in the 1770s leading up to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, what drove people to the idea of considering independence or of extreme anger at the British Crown was the idea of the standing army being used to impose despotism on the colonies. Now, going into the early republic, there were people who were terrified of the idea of a standing army. For one thing, they feared it would be used as a handmaiden for despotism. Now, fortunately, thus far in our history, that has not been the case. Thus far in our history, the men and women of the armed forces have upheld the idea of a republic, have remembered where their allegiances have lied, and have done honorable service in defense of this country in numerous wars. Okay. The second fear, however, was the fear that the military would be used in an ever-expanding warfare state. I'm afraid to say, but that fear has been borne out to be correct. There are people who are fearful that the army would be used, anti-federalists who are fearful that the army would be used to expand an empire into the West. And although I'm not sure if they said it quite this way, the fear of the use of a standing army to dispossess the original inhabitants seems like it was just below the surface. There was there might have been sympathetic sentiment towards the Indians. Remember that the Boston Tea Party had people dressed up as Indians. The symbol of the Indian was a symbol in a way of resistance for white colonists. So, strangely enough, although it's not quite stated that way, it is possible that there might be some degree of sympathy for the Indians among people you wouldn't suspect would have sympathy with the Indians. But that's neither, we don't have necessarily records on that would support that one way or the other. But the bottom line is that the fear that led to the Bill of Rights. Okay, and let's see, it's on page 78 here. Okay, I'm going to be discussing those in a minute. Was the fear really that the new government would be as despotic or more despotic than the old? And as of this point now, this is January, I think it's the 18th, 2012. That's a very real possibility that we might see something more despotic than what we had under King George. And that, to me, is extraordinarily frightening. I mean, if we're talking about empowering the government to shut down websites, we're not talking about a judge in a copyright settlement. We're talking about a branch of the FCC, a branch of the a function of the executive branch empowered by the legislative branch. Or even the idea of holding people indefinitely, citizen or not. Because as I read the Bill of Rights here, I read the first 10 amendments, I don't see the term citizen even mentioned, I see the term person. The Bill of Rights covered persons. Now, there is a question here, and that is, well, what about slavery and what about people who are excluded? Now, to be very clear, the Bill of Rights were not applied to the states in those days. Eventually, with the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights were applied to the states. African Americans were made citizens, and the issue of Native Americans, eventually in 1924, I believe it was, they were made citizens also. Okay, very complex history. I'm not going to sugarcoat it or whitewash it or make it any prettier or uglier, although it's hard to make it uglier than it is, but you understand my point. The bottom line, though, is the idea in the early republic was that the Bill of Rights would apply to persons, and that would include resident aliens. Yes, Andrew Jackson would hang people, but Andrew Jackson didn't help write the Bill of Rights, okay? Yes, you had the Supreme Court precedents stating that the Constitution did not follow the flag, but these judges lived over 100 years later. A Supreme Court justice cannot speak truth into existence. The fact of the matter is the original intent of the Bill of Rights was to cover the rights of all citizens. It was the Enlightenment, it was the age of reason, and the belief is that reason ought to be our guide in understanding the world, not fear, not militant patriotism. And although we talk a whole lot about religion and science and evolution creation, that issue there was the 18th century Enlightenment, sure, people thought about things like that. But when it came to government, the idea of government is that it was to protect the rights of all citizens, period. But also all non-citizens, period. Your religion wasn't going to matter. Your citizenship was not going to matter. Who your king was, if you were a loyal resident alien, was not going to matter. You were protected under the Bill of Rights because that was the reasonable thing to do. And when they drum up fear, and when they drum up militant warmongering, then that gets you out of your reason far more than any kind of religious, we have Dawkins or whoever talking a lot about religion, claiming he's upholding the Age of Enlightenment. No, he's not. Okay, people in the Age of Enlightenment didn't focus a whole lot. The whole idea was to get away from an excessive focus on religion. Their big fear, more than anything else, would be sure, religious dictatorship and the inquisitions of the various religions, sure. But they had an equal fear of demagogues of all stripes arising, using patriotism, using the fear of outsiders, using lies and distortions to gain power. That's why we got a Bill of Rights covering persons. Now, are there questions around the Bill of Rights interpretation? Yes. But it never states in there that it covers only persons. Thank you.